My mother is in the ER and needs $170,000 for emergency heart surgery or she will die. That was the frantic voicemail my older brother Marcus left me on a Tuesday morning. My name is Serena. I am 33. My family thinks I am a struggling freelance coder scraping by in my basement. They have no idea I own and operate a financial technology firm worth millions. I rushed to the hospital in a panic, terrified of losing the mother who always treated me like a second-class citizen. The moment I reached the VIP wing, a nurse dragged me into a supply closet and whispered a warning that shattered my reality. Before continuing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family who underestimated your worth. The smell of bleach hit me as I stumbled through the glass doors of Atlanta General Hospital. I sprinted 3 blocks after abandoning my car in a loading zone. Marcus said the VIP cardiology wing room 412. My mind was a blur. My mother, Yvonne, had never been warm to me. She reserved all maternal affection for Marcus, her golden boy, and his wife Harper. Harper was a white woman from a wealthy suburban family, and my mother worshipped her, convinced Harper elevated our family's social standing. Despite the biting criticism, Yvonne was still my mother. The thought of her heart failing made my own heart ache with a desperate need to save her. I reached the 4th floor, rushing toward the heavy wooden door of room 412, reaching out to push the handle down. Suddenly, a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. I gasped, spinning around. It was a nurse in dark scrubs. Her name tag read Jessica. We had been chemistry lab partners in high school. "Serena, wait!" Jessica hissed, her eyes darting up and down the empty hallway. "Jessica, I cannot wait. My mother is having a heart attack." I pleaded, trying to pull my arm away. Jessica did not let go. Instead, she yanked me backward with surprising strength, pulling me into a dimly lit supply closet right across the hall from room 412. She shut the door behind us, plunging us into the shadows among stacks of saline bags. "Stay quiet," Jessica whispered, her voice tight with an urgency that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Hide here. Do not make a sound. In a few minutes you are going to understand everything." "Understand what?" I asked, trembling. "Is she gone?" The darkness of the supply closet was suffocating, smelling sharply of sterilized plastic and rubbing alcohol. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs that I was certain Jessica could hear it. For a terrifying second, my mind flashed back to when I was 19 years old. I remembered standing in a different hospital corridor, completely panicked after Yvonne had claimed to be suffering from severe chest pains. I had missed my final college exams to rush to her side, only to discover she had faked the entire episode just to force me to co-sign a predatory auto loan for Marcus. She had looked at me with cold, calculating eyes back then and told me that family requires sacrifice. I had paid off that car for 4 years while Marcus drove it into the ground. But this, a VIP cardiology wing, a demand for $170,000, the threat of imminent death, this was on an entirely different catastrophic level. Jessica gripped both of my shoulders, grounding me in the present moment. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the crack in the door. "Serena, listen to me," she whispered fiercely, her voice laced with deep disgust. "I am the head charge nurse on this floor. 20 minutes ago, I was doing my standard rounds. I walked past room 412 to check on the supposedly critical patient that just got admitted. Your sister-in-law Harper was standing in the hallway, handing a crisp $100 bill to a junior orderly, telling him to make sure there were absolutely no interruptions for the next hour." I stared at Jessica, my brain struggling to process her words through the thick fog of my adrenaline. "A bribe." "But the surgeon," Marcus said. "There is no cardiovascular surgeon waiting on standby, Serena." Jessica interrupted, her grip tightening. "I checked the master hospital registry the second I recognized your brother's name on the intake forms. Your mother was not brought in by an ambulance. They drove her here in Harper's luxury SUV. They bypassed the standard emergency room triage entirely by paying a massive out-of-pocket premium deposit to book this specific VIP recovery suite. It is a room typically reserved for wealthy cosmetic surgery patients who want absolute privacy. She has not been evaluated by a single cardiologist today. She doesn't even have an IV in her arm." The sheer weight of Jessica's revelation hung heavily in the cramped space. The frantic, terrified daughter inside of me desperately wanted to deny it, but the seasoned analytical CEO who ran a multi-million-dollar empire recognized the undeniable pattern of a highly coordinated scam. "Just look," Jessica said. She gently pushed the closet door open a fraction of an inch, creating a perfect unobstructed view straight into the VIP suite across the hall. The door to room 412 was slightly ajar. I leaned forward, bracing myself to see my mother hooked up to a ventilator fighting for her life. What I saw made the air rush out of my lungs. Yvonne was not on a ventilator. She was sitting up in the plush hospital bed looking completely healthy. She wore expensive silk pajamas, casually scrolling through her phone, sipping a caramel latte. Marcus and Harper stood next to the bed. Nobody was crying. Nobody was panicking. In fact, they were laughing. "I have to admit, Mother Yvonne, this is top-tier acting," Harper said, taking a sip from her iced matcha. She tossed her blonde hair and smirked. "That fake heart attack routine in the driveway was Oscar-worthy. You almost had the paramedics fooled." My mother chuckled. "You have to make it look real, Harper. Serena is stubborn, but she is weak when it comes to family emergencies. We put her in a panic and she will empty whatever pathetic savings account she has." "She had better," Marcus chimed in, adjusting his designer watch. "I told her the surgeon needs exactly $170,000 transferred immediately, or the hospital will not operate. That basement coder never leaves the house, so she has to have cash hoarded away somewhere." Harper crossed her arms. "She owes this family anyway. She sits at her computer doing nothing while you run a prestigious church scholarship fund, Marcus. Once that little freak hands over the $170,000, we can finally put the down payment on that yacht in Miami. Think about how incredible the Instagram photos will look." Yvonne nodded in agreement. "You are absolutely right, sweetie. Serena owes us. If I had not put a roof over her head, she would not even have a computer to type on. Her money is Marcus's money. It is the least she can do." I stood in the supply closet, feeling the walls spin around me. There was no heart failure. There was no medical emergency. It was an elaborate extortion plot. My own mother and brother were using my deepest fears to rob me blind, so my entitled sister-in-law could buy a luxury boat. A strange sensation washed over me. The panic and fear instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute rage. For 33 years, I had let them belittle me. I had let them mock my career. I had let them treat me like a disappointment. "She is taking too long," Marcus complained, pulling his phone out of his pocket. "I will call her again and tell her the doctor is bringing out the defibrillator. That should speed up the wire transfer." He dialed my number. A second later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I looked at Jessica. She gave me a slow, affirming nod and stepped back. I did not answer his phone call. Instead, I silenced the device, pushed the closet door open, walked across the hallway, and kicked the door of room 412 completely wide open. The sudden violent crash of the door hitting the wall silenced their laughter instantly, and 3 pairs of completely shocked eyes snapped toward me as I finally stepped into the room. The plastic cup slipped from my mother's fingers. It hit the linoleum floor with a wet thud, splattering warm caramel latte across the pristine white hospital blankets and her expensive silk pajamas. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in pure, unadulterated shock. The 3 of them stared at me as if a ghost had just kicked down the door. Then the performance began. Yvonne gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest as she collapsed back against the pillows. She began to hyperventilate, squeezing her eyes shut and letting out a series of dramatic, agonizing groans. Her transition from a relaxed, coffee-sipping schemer to a dying woman was seamless. She clutched the fabric of her shirt, thrashing her head side to side, crying out that her heart was giving out and that the shock of my sudden entrance was killing her. Marcus snapped out of his daze. He lunged toward the hospital bed, grabbing Yvonne's hand with exaggerated panic, then whirled around to face me. His face was red with manufactured rage. He shouted that I was trying to murder our mother with my selfish, dramatic behavior. He demanded to know why I was just standing there by the door like a useless statue instead of helping. He yelled that the cardiovascular surgeon was waiting down the hall. The hospital administration was threatening to discharge her within the hour. And if I did not wire the $170,000 right this very second, her blood would be on my hands forever. He pulled out his phone, shoved it in my direction, and screamed at me to open my banking app immediately. I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, and my expression completely void of the panic they were expecting to see. I looked at the spilled coffee dripping onto the floor, then at the pulse monitor that was steadily beeping a perfectly normal, healthy rhythm, and finally directly into my brother's eyes. I told him in a voice as cold as ice that I was not giving him a single dime. Marcus scoffed, dropping his phone to his side. He stepped away from the hospital bed and closed the distance between us, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. The mask of the grieving son vanished, replaced by the arrogant bully I had known my entire life. He told me I was always exactly like this, a bitter, jealous, broke loser who could not stand to see anyone else in the family succeed. He laughed, a cruel, harsh sound that echoed off the sterile walls. He said he should have expected this pathetic behavior from the miserable girl who was too cheap and too selfish to even show up to his wedding. He reminded me how incredibly embarrassing it was to stand in front of Harper's wealthy, connected family and explain that his own flesh and blood sister was too poor to buy a decent dress and attend the ceremony. He accused me of harboring a lifelong grudge because I was a lonely basement dweller while he was building a respectable, high-status life. The audacity of his words sent a jolt of electricity through my veins. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of his accusation burned away any remaining shred of family loyalty I held. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the room like shattered glass. I looked right at him and asked if he actually believed the delusional lies he told himself and his wealthy in-laws. I reminded him exactly why I missed that luxurious country club wedding. I was not sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. I was working 3 back-to-back shifts at a miserable data entry center, eating instant noodles for every meal, and sleeping exactly 4 hours a night. I was destroying my own health to pay off the $30,000 debt he left in my name. I stepped closer to him, forcing him to hold my gaze. I reminded him how he took my only car without asking, drove it blackout drunk into a commercial storefront, and cowardly fled the scene. I reminded him how he left me to face the police interrogation, the insurance fraud investigators, and the terrifying financial ruin. I told him he got to drink expensive imported champagne and cut a 4-tier fondant cake paid for by Harper's parents, while I scrubbed floors and took on freelance coding gigs just to keep myself from being evicted and thrown out onto the streets because of his criminal negligence. I told him he was nothing but a parasite who built his entire life on the money and credit he stole from the women around him. Harper rolled her eyes, completely unbothered by the revelation of her husband's past crimes. She stepped forward, her expensive designer perfume masking the smell of spilled coffee and sterile hospital air. She dropped the concerned daughter-in-law act, entirely revealing the entitled, manipulative predator lurking beneath her polished exterior. She looked at me with a cold, calculated glare and told me nobody cared about my pathetic ancient history. She crossed her arms, tapped her perfectly manicured nails against her elbow, and issued a chilling ultimatum. She said she was giving me exactly 60 seconds to unlock my phone and initiate the wire transfer to the account Marcus provided. If I refused, she was going to press the emergency call button, bring hospital security and the local police into the room, and have me arrested for elder abuse and assault. She smiled, a terrifying, predatory smile, her eyes gleaming with malice. She told me the police would absolutely believe a respectable, well-dressed, crying family over a hysterical, estranged daughter who barged into a VIP medical suite and caused her fragile mother to go into severe cardiac arrest. She took a deliberate step toward the red emergency button on the wall, her finger hovering just inches away from the plastic panel waiting for my submission. I did not flinch. I did not beg. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored black blazer and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. I walked right past Harper, completely ignoring her hovering finger, and dropped the document directly onto my mother's lap, right next to the spreading puddle of spilled coffee. I told Harper to go ahead and press the red emergency button. I dared her to call security and the police into this hospital room so we could all have a fascinating, public conversation about the preliminary VIP billing statement sitting on the bed. Yvonne picked up the paper, her eyes frantically scanning the bold red letters. Harper's hand slowly dropped away from the wall. I watched the arrogant color drain entirely from her perfectly contoured face as I explained that I had stopped at the billing department on my way up to the 4th floor. I informed them that the platinum credit card Harper had confidently used to book this luxury recovery suite had just been declined for insufficient funds. I asked Harper how exactly she planned to explain to the police that a woman who supposedly had the immense wealth and social status to command a private hospital wing could not even clear a basic $5,000 deposit. I asked her if her wealthy suburban parents knew she was desperately maxing out her credit cards to maintain a pathetic illusion of grandeur while shaking down her sister-in-law for cash. Harper let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. Her face turned a violent shade of crimson, the pristine mask of suburban entitlement completely shattering under the crushing weight of her immediate financial humiliation. She lunged toward me, her manicured hands curled into tight fists, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had absolutely no right to look into her personal finances. Before she could close the short distance between us, Marcus stepped forward, grabbing his furious wife by the shoulders and forcefully pulling her back. He told her to calm down and stop letting me get under her skin with my cheap tricks. He let out a dark, arrogant chuckle, shaking his head side to side as if I were merely a petulant child who had just played a harmless, stupid prank. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive jacket, puffing out his chest with an irritating air of absolute, unquestionable superiority. He told me I could keep my pathetic little savings account and my smug attitude because they did not actually need my money anymore. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the nearby armchair and pulled out a thick, notarized legal document. He held it up directly to the harsh fluorescent hospital lights, loudly tapping the golden embossed seal at the bottom of the page. He proudly announced that our mother had signed a comprehensive power of attorney over to him at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Yvonne nodded eagerly from the hospital bed, declaring that Marcus was the man of the family and the only person she ever trusted to handle her financial affairs. I stared at the thick legal document, keeping my face perfectly neutral and utterly unbothered. I asked Marcus what exactly he planned to do with a power of attorney for a woman who had zero liquid assets, absolutely no savings, and a massive mountain of outstanding credit card debt. Marcus smiled a wide, sickeningly predatory smile. He walked right up to me, aggressively invading my personal space, and told me I was completely forgetting about the ultimate crown jewel of our entire family history. He told me he had just used the power of attorney to mortgage Big Mama's historic house. A heavy, suffocating silence immediately fell over the cold hospital room. Big Mama's house was not just real estate to our community. It was the physical heart of our lineage, the safe, loving haven our grandmother had worked her entire life to buy, the sacred place where our family had gathered for 3 generations. Marcus gloated that the property value had skyrocketed over the last decade due to rapid gentrification in the surrounding neighborhood. He bragged that he had found a private expedited lending firm willing to entirely bypass the usual corporate banking red tape. He proudly declared that he had leveraged the entire estate, putting the deed up as direct collateral to secure a fast, high-interest commercial loan for exactly $170,000. He said the funds were going to clear any minute now, giving him the exact amount of cash he needed to permanently fix his problems and secure his yacht. Yvonne clapped her hands together, loudly praising Marcus for his brilliant business mindset and insisting that Big Mama would have wanted him to use the historic house to elevate the family name. Harper smoothed down her blonde hair, her arrogant smirk returning as she leaned heavily against Marcus. She told me I was officially dismissed, waving her hand toward the heavy door and ordering me to crawl back to my miserable, lonely life. Marcus pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket, his thumb swiping quickly across the glass screen. He shoved the phone directly into my face, the bright screen illuminating the shadows. He pointed to an automated email from the private bank, confirming that the massive loan application for $170,000 had been formally submitted and was in the final stage of processing. He sneered, telling me to look closely at what real success and absolute power looked like. He told me I would never understand the kind of high-stakes moves it took to be a winner. I did not blink. I did not look away from the glowing screen. I simply smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made the triumphant grin falter on his face. I looked Marcus dead in the eyes, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper. I told him to refresh his inbox, Marcus let out a dismissive breath, shaking his head as if I had suggested the sky was falling. He muttered that I was bluffing, desperate to claw back some dignity after being defeated. He raised his phone higher, his thumb hovering over the screen. He confidently swiped down to refresh his email application, keeping the screen angled toward me so I could witness my failure in real time. A loading icon spun. A new email popped into his inbox from the private lending firm. I watched his eyes track the bold text of the subject line. The arrogant light vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by sudden panic. His jaw went slack. His hand began to tremble so violently that the device nearly slipped from his grasp. He tapped the email, his eyes darting frantically across the digital letter, searching for a typo. He stammered, insisting that there had to be a clerical mistake. Harper lost her patience. She snatched the phone right out of his hand, her manicured nails scraping against the plastic case. She read the email aloud, her voice rising in pitch with every word. The message stated that the commercial loan application had been flagged for fraud and immediately denied because the property offered as collateral did not legally belong to Yvonne. Harper whipped her head around to glare at her husband, demanding to know what kind of incompetent bank he was dealing with. She yelled that the historic family house had been passed down for 50 years and Yvonne was the sole heir. She clutched her silk pajamas, insisting she had never signed the house away to anyone. She looked at Marcus, demanding he call the bank president immediately and threaten them with a massive lawsuit for defamation. I calmly walked over to the foot of the hospital bed. I told them they could call every bank executive in Georgia, but it would not change the legal reality of the county public records. I explained that the bank was perfectly correct. Yvonne could not legally mortgage the historic property because she had not owned it for 3 years. Marcus turned a sickening shade of gray. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. I looked at Yvonne, who was staring at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. I asked her if she remembered the winter 3 years ago when Marcus told her he needed to borrow the property deed to show some investors his family backing. I asked her if she remembered when mysterious men in dark SUVs started parking across the street from the house, watching the windows at all hours of the night. Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I turned my attention back to Marcus, who was visibly shrinking away from me. I laid out the exact truth. I revealed that Marcus had not shown the deed to investors. He had secretly used the historic family home as collateral to secure a massive loan from a ring of violent local loan sharks to cover his disastrous cryptocurrency losses. When he inevitably defaulted on the payments, those men prepared to seize the property and throw our mother out onto the street. I told them that I was the one who intercepted the foreclosure. I liquidated my personal stock portfolio, met with the loan sharks, and paid off his debt entirely in cash. In exchange, I legally transferred the deed solely into my name to permanently protect the historic legacy from his reckless behavior. I smiled at my mother and brother, letting the absolute weight of the truth crush their delusions. I informed them that they were not the masters of a grand family estate. They were living in my house, sleeping under my roof, entirely rent-free by my grace alone. The illusion of control shattered completely. The room descended into absolute chaos. Yvonne began to hyperventilate for real this time, clutching her chest as she realized she owned absolutely nothing. Harper dropped the phone onto the floor, her breathing heavy and ragged. She stared at Marcus, her eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged realization. The yacht was gone. The Instagram photos were gone. But more importantly, the money they desperately needed was not coming. Harper lunged at Marcus, grabbing him by the collar of his expensive jacket. She shook him, screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why this specific loan was so critically important today. She yelled that they had credit cards, they had lines of credit, they had her parents. So why did he tell her they needed exactly $170,000 in cash before the banks closed this afternoon? She demanded to know what he was hiding from her. Marcus tried to pull away, stammering nonsensical excuses about investment deadlines and escrow accounts. His eyes darted frantically toward the door as if looking for an escape route. I stepped right into his path, blocking his exit. I cornered him against the medical machinery, invading his space just as he had done to me earlier. I lowered my voice, cutting through her hysterical screaming. I asked him the one question he dreaded most. I asked him why he needed exactly $170,000 today to balance a ledger. I asked him what exactly he did with the Church Legacy Scholarship Fund. Marcus froze, the blood entirely leaving his face. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. Harper gasped loudly behind me, finally connecting the dots of his criminal incompetence. She realized her husband had not just made a bad investment, he had stolen from a federal nonprofit entity. Harper let out a visceral scream of rage. She raised her hand and slapped Marcus across the face with such vicious force that the sharp crack echoed off the walls. She shoved him backward against the wall, grabbed her phone from the floor, and frantically began dialing an elite corporate law firm, screaming that she was not going to federal prison for a useless broke failure. Harper did not wait for a response from the corporate law firm before she disconnected the call and violently jabbed 3 new numbers into her phone screen. She was calling the police. I watched in fascination as a terrifying physical transformation overtook her entirely. The screaming woman who had just assaulted her husband vanished into thin air. In her place, a trembling, terrified suburban housewife materialized. As the dispatcher answered, Harper let out a perfectly pitched, breathless sob. She pitched her voice an octave higher, weeping hysterically into the receiver. She cried out that she needed officers dispatched immediately. She claimed a violently unhinged woman had barricaded her way into a private VIP suite. Harper fed the dispatcher a flawless narrative of pure victimhood. She wept that this aggressive intruder was threatening her fragile mother-in-law and trying to extort thousands of dollars from their family. She weaponized her tears with the practiced ease of a woman who had never faced a consequence in her life of privilege. She pleaded with the dispatcher to hurry, insisting she feared for her life and that the dangerous woman was blocking the exit. She hung up the phone, her shoulders heaving with fake sobs, but when she looked at me, her eyes were completely dry and burning with malicious satisfaction. She had deployed the ultimate weapon she possessed, expecting my absolute destruction to follow. I slowly turned my gaze away from Harper and looked at the woman in the hospital bed. I looked at Yvonne, the woman who had systematically pushed me aside for 33 years. Surely she would draw the line here. Surely a mother would not allow her own daughter to be falsely arrested just to protect a daughter-in-law who had assaulted her golden child. I stared into Yvonne's eyes, offering her one final opportunity to tell the truth and stop this unhinged madness before the authorities arrived. I waited for her to demand that Harper cancel the fabricated report. Instead, Yvonne pulled the silk blankets tighter and glared at me with pure hatred. She fully backed Harper's malicious lie without a single ounce of hesitation. Yvonne pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was a bitter, vindictive monster who always wanted to ruin my brother's perfect life. She accused me of being a deeply disturbed individual who was purposefully trying to tear this respectable family apart out of sheer petty jealousy. She declared that she would gladly tell the responding officers whatever they needed to hear to have me locked away. She told me I brought this entirely upon myself by refusing to be a supportive sister and an obedient daughter. The final thread of my maternal hope snapped, leaving behind nothing but a liberating, freezing void. The tension in the sterile hospital suite became thick and suffocating as we waited for the inevitable arrival of the authorities. The silence was only broken by the rhythmic, steady beeping of the cardiovascular monitor connected to a perfectly healthy woman who was actively conspiring to send her own child to jail. Marcus was completely unraveling. He paced frantically back and forth across the small stretch of linoleum floor at the foot of the bed. His breathing was heavy and erratic. I was sweating profusely, the dark moisture staining the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. He kept running his trembling hands over his face, muttering incomprehensible apologies to Harper, terrified of the catastrophic financial crimes he could no longer hide. He was a cornered rat, fully realizing that his entire house of cards was collapsing around him in real time. Harper ignored his pathetic apologies, standing rigidly by the window with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, mentally preparing her victim performance for the impending police arrival. In the midst of their spiraling panic, I simply walked over to the corner of the room, pulled up a small vinyl visitor chair, and sat down. I crossed my legs, rested my hands comfortably in my lap, and leaned back. I was completely unbothered. I did not pace. I did not argue. I did not attempt to plead my case or defend my innocence to people committed to misunderstanding me. I just sat there in absolute, terrifying calm, watching them squirm in the psychological prison they had just built for themselves, sitting in that cheap vinyl chair surrounded by the erratic pacing of my panicked brother and the fake tears of my sister-in-law. My mind briefly drifted away from the pathetic hospital room. I thought back to exactly 72 hours ago, when the foundation of their absolute destruction had been meticulously laid. It was a Saturday night. I had been sitting in the highly secure subterranean server room of Aegis Financial Headquarters. The ambient temperature was a constant chilling 64 degrees to keep the massive supercomputers cool. David, my brilliant chief operating officer, had called my secure line at exactly 2 in the morning. Our proprietary AI tracking systems, which were currently auditing thousands of charitable accounts in preparation for our Department of Defense contract, had tripped a massive glaring red alert. I remembered staring at the glowing monitors alongside David as lines of complex encrypted code unspooled across the screens. The AI had detected a highly sophisticated, unauthorized intrusion into the community church's legacy scholarship fund. At first, we assumed it was a standard external cyber attack originating from an overseas syndicate. But as my forensic analysts began to isolate the digital footprints stripping away the proxy servers and the VPN masking protocols, the IP address did not route to Russia or Eastern Europe. It routed directly to a suburban IP address in the wealthy outskirts of Atlanta. It routed to Harper and Marcus's custom-built smart home. The betrayal had tasted like metallic ash in my mouth. For a brief, agonizing hour, I had sat in the dark server room watching the digital ghost of my own flesh and blood systematically siphon $170,000 away from disadvantaged children. I watched him run the stolen funds through a digital tumbler, converting the cash into decentralized cryptocurrency before bouncing it through shell companies in Delaware and Nevada. It was a sloppy, arrogant attempt at money laundering executed by a man who mistakenly believed he was the smartest person in the room. That night, David had asked me if I wanted to anonymously tip off the local authorities and let standard law enforcement handle the breach. I had looked at the undeniable proof of Marcus's profound moral bankruptcy and made a cold, calculated decision. I told David to hold the alert. I instructed my entire cybersecurity team to silently shadow the money mapping every single digital node without triggering a firewall alarm. I knew my brother. I knew he was arrogant, greedy, and financially desperate. I knew that once the church funds were locked in the offshore holding account, he would need clean, untraceable liquidity to cover his immediate local debts and fund Harper's extravagant lifestyle. I knew he would inevitably come hunting for my money next. So I had waited. I let them plot. I let them build their elaborate theatrical extortion scheme with the fake heart attack and the VIP hospital room. They thought they were manipulating a naive, helpless sister. They had absolutely no idea they had just willingly walked into a federal high-tech guillotine that I had personally designed, calibrated, and sharpened just for them. The agonizing wait stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it could not have been more than 10 minutes. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere inside the VIP suite felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Marcus continued his frantic pacing, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door every few seconds. Harper kept checking the reflection on her phone screen, making sure her hair looked appropriately disheveled and her makeup appeared authentically distressed for the performance she was about to deliver. Yvonne whimpered dramatically from the bed, still trying to sell the illusion of a fragile woman under siege. I remained perfectly still in my chair, calculating my next move with absolute precision. Then the distinct rhythmic sound of heavy footsteps echoed loudly down the pristine hospital corridor. The heavy boots hit the linoleum floor with purpose and authority, moving rapidly toward room 412. The doorknob clicked and turned downward. The heavy door was pushed wide open. Two uniformed local police officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, their eyes immediately scanning the space for the violent threat they had been dispatched to neutralize. They were flanked by a tall, sharply dressed man clutching an expensive leather briefcase. I was a slick, high-priced corporate lawyer dispatched directly by Harper's influential father to ensure my absolute legal destruction. The officers zeroed in on me, their expressions hardening, as they prepared to execute the violent arrest Harper had so carefully orchestrated. Harper immediately launched into her fake sobbing routine, pointing her manicured finger directly at my calm face. The ultimate moment of truth had finally arrived, and I was entirely ready for it. The taller of the two police officers unclipped his radio, his hand resting menacingly on his duty belt as he stepped directly into my personal space. He barked a sharp command, ordering me to keep my hands completely visible and step away from the hospital bed. Harper wailed louder, shrinking behind her slick corporate lawyer, performing the role of the terrified, defenseless victim with absolute perfection. The lawyer, a man whose expensive silk tie and condescending smirk practically screamed. Old Money stepped forward and introduced himself as Bradley Sterling. He did not even bother to acknowledge me as a human being. He turned immediately to the officers, handing them his business card, and smoothly taking total control of the narrative. He told the officers that I was an estranged, financially desperate relative who had violently forced my way into a private medical suite to harass my critically ill mother. The officers nodded sympathetically at Harper, their inherent bias blinding them entirely to the reality of the situation. They looked at me with open disgust, ready to slap the cuffs on my wrists right then and there. I did not raise my hands. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked dead on the lawyer. I asked him if it was standard legal practice to bring police officers to a hospital room for a simple family dispute, or if he was here to conduct an illegal shakedown on behalf of his wealthy client. Sterling let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. He snapped his leather briefcase open on the small rolling medical table and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slammed them down onto the table with a loud, aggressive thud. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and declared that I was not dealing with a simple family dispute. He accused me of committing massive coordinated wire fraud. He told the officers that his firm had just uncovered undeniable proof that I had used my specialized computer skills to hack into the community church database. He spun a fantastical, completely fabricated story about how the bitter and broke basement coder, had systematically embezzled $170,000 from the Legacy Scholarship Fund. Yvonne gasped dramatically from the bed, covering her mouth with her hands, as if this was the first time she was hearing this malicious lie. Harper sobbed into a tissue, crying out that it broke her heart to see her husband's life work destroyed by his own jealous sister. Sterling leaned over the table, crowding my space, his breath smelling of stale coffee and expensive mints. He tapped the top page of the document stack. He told me he had drafted a full written confession, along with a legally binding property transfer deed. He laid out his twisted, extortionate deal with absolute confidence. He said if I signed the house over to Marcus right now, the family would consider the stolen church funds fully repaid. He promised that if I gave them the historic property, they would generously decline to press federal charges, and I could walk out of the hospital as a free woman. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. He told me that if I refused to sign away my house, he would personally ensure the police dragged me out in handcuffs, and I would spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary for cybercrimes against a religious institution. The sheer audacity of the setup was breathtaking. They had orchestrated a flawless trap, weaponizing Harper's wealthy connections, the local police force, and my mother's complete lack of morals to legally steal my house and cover up their own massive financial crimes. I slowly turned my gaze away from the arrogant lawyer and looked directly at my older brother. Marcus was standing near the heart monitor, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. His hands were trembling so badly he had to shove them deep into his pockets. I gave him one final silent opportunity to salvage a tiny fraction of his humanity. I stared into his eyes, silently pleading with him to stop this madness. I asked him directly and clearly if he was really going to let his wife and her lawyer send his own sister to federal prison for a crime he committed. The room went dead silent. The officers looked at Marcus, waiting for his response. Yvonne glared at her son, silently demanding his compliance. Harper shot him a lethal warning look. Marcus swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. He looked at the floor, unable to meet my steady gaze. He opened his mouth, his voice cracking into a pathetic, cowardly whisper. He said that I was always jealous of his success. He took a shaky breath, looked up at the police officers, and stated that I was the one who stole the money. He threw his own flesh and blood directly under the bus to save his pathetic lifestyle. A freezing absolute calm washed over my entire body. The final lingering emotional tie to my biological family disintegrated into dust. I looked back at the lawyer, ignoring the confession documents lying on the table. I asked Bradley Sterling if he was absolutely sure he wanted to tie his prestigious career and his elite law firm to this specific case. I asked him with a chilling, genuine curiosity if he truly understood that submitting those forged extortion documents to a police officer would officially make him an active accessory to federal wire fraud and massive embezzlement. Sterling scoffed loudly, aggressively, shaking his head and completely dismissing my clear warning as the desperate, utterly pathetic bluff of a cornered criminal. He turned his back to me, looked at the taller police officer standing near the hospital bed, and sharply ordered him to put the heavy steel cuffs on my wrists immediately, without any further delay whatsoever in the room. The lead federal agent ignored Harper and her frantic demands to clear the hospital room. He stepped past the local police officers, turned his attention directly to me, gave a crisp nod, and stated that they had traced the ping perfectly. He called me his boss and confirmed that the hospital perimeter was secure. A heavy silence crashed down over the sterile medical suite. Marcus dropped his jaw, staring at the armed federal agent standing at my side. Yvonne clutched her silk sheets, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the men in windbreakers, as if she were watching a bizarre hallucination unfold. Harper took a stumbling step backward, the sheer shock momentarily freezing her arrogant features into a mask of confusion. Bradley Sterling, the slick corporate lawyer who had just threatened to throw me in a federal penitentiary, suddenly looked as though he had swallowed a mouthful of broken glass. He looked at the senior investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission, then looked at me, his arrogant smirk melting away into a grimace of absolute terror. I took a slow, deliberate breath, smoothing down the front of my tailored black blazer. I stepped out of the corner of the room and walked straight toward the foot of the hospital bed. I looked directly at my older brother, who was trembling so violently that his designer shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor. I told Marcus that it was time to introduce myself to the entire family. I stated that I was not a broke, struggling freelancer scraping by in a basement. I declared that I had never been a low-level coder taking online gigs just to pay the rent. I raised my voice, ensuring that every single person in the room could hear the absolute authority resonating in my tone. I announced that I was the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial. I let the name of my company hang in the cold hospital air, watching as the senior federal investigator offered a supportive nod to validate my claim. Harper scoffed, though the sound was weak and devoid of her usual confidence. She tried to mock me, stammering that a fake title at a fictional startup did not make me immune to the law. I turned my gaze toward her, my expression hardening into absolute ice. I informed Harper that Aegis Financial was not a fictional startup. I explained that my company was a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity and digital auditing firm. I revealed that we did not just build basic security software for small businesses. I told her that Aegis Financial held highly classified government contracts. I stated that we were the exact firm directly contracted by the federal government to actively monitor, trace, and expose large-scale financial fraud across massive nonprofit organizations and charitable institutions nationwide. I watched Bradley Sterling physically recoil, his expensive leather briefcase suddenly looking like a massive liability in his sweaty hands. He knew exactly who Aegis Financial was, and he realized he had just attempted to extort the chief executive of a federally backed cybersecurity empire. I turned my attention back to Marcus. I asked him if he honestly believed he possessed the intellectual capacity to quietly steal money from a community church without triggering a massive digital alarm. I told my brother that my proprietary artificial intelligence systems had flagged his suspicious accounting activities over a week ago. I explained that my software had instantly detected the exact moment he attempted to funnel $170,000 out of the Legacy Scholarship Fund. I told him that my team of elite digital forensic analysts had been silently tracking his sloppy financial maneuvers for 7 straight days. I revealed that the federal agent standing in the room had already secured the necessary warrants and finalized the digital evidence required to put him away. Yvonne gasped, pressing her hands against her cheeks as the reality of my words shattered her perfect illusion. I leaned closer to Marcus, making sure he felt the crushing weight of his monumental failure. I told him I did not come to the hospital today because I was scared. I told him I only showed up to this pathetic medical suite to give him one final desperate opportunity to confess his crimes like a man and protect his own sister. I told him he failed that test miserably when he blindly threw me under the bus to save his own miserable skin. The 2 local police officers, who had been fully prepared to arrest me just moments earlier, slowly took a step back toward the door. They looked at the federal agents, then at the terrified lawyer, realizing they had been manipulated into participating in a malicious illegal shakedown by a deeply corrupt family. One officer discreetly lowered his hand away from his handcuffs, wanting nothing to do with the federal storm that was about to rain down upon Harper and Marcus. The undeniable shift in power was palpable. Marcus opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate an excuse, a lie, or a pathetic plea for mercy. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. I raised my left arm, lifting my wrist to display my sleek smartwatch. I tapped a rapid sequence of commands into the glowing digital interface, establishing an immediate connection with the massive smart television mounted securely on the hospital room wall. I told my family and their slick corporate lawyer that they did not have to simply take my word for it. I told them I was going to show them exactly how a real professional dismantles a criminal operation in broad daylight, step by step. I pressed the final secure confirmation button on my watch, instantly casting my company's live auditing dashboard directly onto the large television screen for absolutely everyone in the room to see clearly. The massive smart television mounted on the hospital wall flickered to life, instantly bathing the sterile medical suite in a harsh, pulsing blue light. My proprietary auditing software immediately commanded the screen, mapping out a staggering, undeniable web of illicit financial transactions. Everyone in the room stood paralyzed, their eyes glued to the glowing monitor, as decades of my family's fabricated superiority unraveled in real time. The digital paper trail was absolute and merciless. It displayed the initial unauthorized withdrawal of exactly $170,000 from the Community Church Legacy Scholarship Fund. The money did not just vanish into thin air. It did not simply move from one local bank to another. The screen displayed a meticulously coordinated sequence of automated transfers. The stolen funds were laundered through a highly sophisticated network of anonymous shell companies. Bright red lines traced the stolen cash as it bounced from a fake consulting firm in Delaware to a phantom real estate holding company in Nevada, purposely designed to obscure the original source of the massive theft. The sheer complexity of the digital laundering operation was breathtaking. I slowly turned my attention back to my older brother. Marcus was staring at the television screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His mouth hung slightly open, and his expensive tailored shirt was entirely soaked with cold, nervous sweat. I looked at him with absolute indifference. I told him that I had known him my entire life, and I knew for a definitive fact that he did not possess the intellectual capacity to orchestrate a multi-layered wire fraud operation. Marcus was a man who had repeatedly failed basic college accounting classes and relied on our mother to balance his personal checkbook every month. He was merely a convenient, easily manipulated pawn in a much larger, darker game. He was the foolish, arrogant insider with the administrative access required to authorize the initial withdrawal from the vulnerable church accounts. But he was absolutely not the criminal mastermind who designed this complex digital labyrinth. He simply lacked the necessary intelligence, the discipline, and the strategic foresight to build a money laundering network that could successfully bypass standard banking regulations and federal oversight protocols. He was nothing but a useful idiot. I tapped another rapid command sequence into my smartwatch. The massive television screen instantly zoomed in on the final node of the digital map. The sprawling web of shell companies and fake corporate entities all converged into a single undeniable endpoint. A bright red alert box flashed across the screen, highlighting the ultimate destination of the stolen community funds. The money had been successfully funneled completely out of the United States. It was sitting securely in an offshore, high-yield private banking account located deep within the Cayman Islands. The federal agents in the room leaned forward, their eyes locked intently on the undeniable digital evidence confirming the international crime. I looked directly at my arrogant sister-in-law. Harper had suddenly stopped crying. Her fake, victimized suburban housewife persona completely evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer panicked desperation. I raised my voice, ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute devastating truth. I read the name attached to the offshore account directly off the glowing screen. The hidden Cayman Islands account was not registered to Marcus. It was officially undeniably registered under Harper's maiden name. The ultimate betrayal was now fully exposed. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down over the VIP medical suite. Yvonne let out a strangled, breathless gasp from the hospital bed. She looked at her precious, highly educated, upper-class daughter-in-law with a mixture of total disbelief and absolute horror. The woman she had worshipped, the woman she had viciously alienated her own flesh and blood daughter to impress, had just been mathematically proven to be a ruthless, calculating federal criminal. Marcus stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a rolling medical tray. He looked at Harper, his eyes wide with the crushing realization that his entire marriage was nothing but a manipulative financial setup. Harper had deliberately used his administrative access to rob his own community church, leaving him to take the entire catastrophic fall while she secured a massive offshore nest egg for herself. Harper opened her mouth frantically, trying to deny the indisputable digital evidence displayed on the screen. She stammered nervously, insisting that the offshore account was a completely legitimate trust fund set up by her wealthy father, and that the incoming international transfers were just a massive, unfortunate accounting misunderstanding. Her voice trembled with raw, unadulterated fear. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, but found absolutely no one. Her eyes landed on Bradley Sterling, the slick corporate lawyer dispatched to orchestrate my false arrest. She reached toward him, demanding he file an injunction against my software and force the agents to leave. Bradley Sterling did not move to help her. The arrogant smirk that plastered his face was completely gone. He stared at the television screen, his mind calculating the apocalyptic legal reality of his current situation. He was an attorney who had just attempted to use local police to extort a false confession from a federal executive while standing directly in front of armed FBI agents and a senior SEC investigator. The digital evidence of massive wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement was flashing in high definition right before his eyes. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. He realized that if he remained in this room for even one more minute, he would be permanently implicated as an accessory to a federal crime ring. Sterling slowly, deliberately stepped away from Harper. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the federal agents, raising his hands in a gesture of unconditional surrender. He gripped his leather briefcase, took another step backward toward the hospital door, and stated with absolute finality, "I am no longer your legal counsel." The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the fleeing lawyer, sealing Harper inside the room with the federal agents, the local police, and the undeniable reality of her own destruction. She stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds. Her chest heaved. Her eyes darted wildly around the VIP suite, searching for a loophole, a technicality, or another wealthy connection she could exploit. When she realized there was absolutely no escape, the final fragments of her pristine, suburban grace disintegrated. She whipped around to face her husband. She did not look at him with the desperation of a loving partner caught in a tragedy. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Harper lunged at Marcus, shoving him violently against the medical monitoring equipment. She screamed that he was an entirely useless, pathetic excuse for a man. She shrieked that she had wasted the best years of her life pretending to respect a spineless, broke failure who could not even execute a simple financial transfer without getting caught by his own sister. Marcus held his hands up in a desperate, trembling attempt to pacify her, begging her to calm down and promising they could figure it out together. Harper swatted his hands away with violent disgust. She laughed a harsh, maniacal sound that echoed off the sterile walls. She screamed right into his face that she never loved him for a single second. She declared that the only reason she ever tolerated his mediocre presence was to gain direct, unfettered access to the massive legacy scholarship accounts his family controlled. She told him he was nothing but a gullible, convenient stepping stone to the affluent lifestyle she actually deserved. Marcus stumbled backward, tears of shock and humiliation welling in his eyes. He stammered, asking how she could say such cruel things after everything they had built together. Harper did not soften. Backed into an inescapable corner by the federal authorities, her carefully maintained mask of progressive high society tolerance completely shattered. She unleashed a torrent of venomous, deeply entrenched prejudice that she had clearly harbored for years. She hurled vicious, unapologetic racial slurs at her husband. She screamed that she was sick and tired of pretending to fit into their culture, sick of attending their community church, and absolutely sick of associating with people she viewed as inherently beneath her. She turned her venomous gaze toward Yvonne, who was sitting frozen in the hospital bed. Harper pointed a shaking finger at the older woman and unleashed a tirade of staggering cruelty. She mocked Yvonne for trying so desperately to emulate wealth and status. She laughed at how easily she had manipulated the older woman with cheap compliments and fake affection. She explicitly stated her absolute disgust for the entire family, declaring that associating with them had been a humiliating, degrading chore she only endured to secure her offshore retirement fund. Harper screamed that she was a woman of true pedigree and privilege, and she absolutely refused to let her life be ruined by a group of people she considered fundamentally inferior in every possible way. Yvonne clutched the silk sheets covering her lap, her knuckles turning completely white. Her jaw trembled violently. The horrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon her with the force of a freight train. She sat in absolute paralyzed horror as the beautiful, wealthy white daughter-in-law she had practically worshipped treated her like absolute garbage. Yvonne had spent years systematically alienating her own biological daughter. She had mocked my career, dismissed my achievements, and actively conspired to steal my property and send me to federal prison, all to protect and elevate Harper. She had believed that Harper was the ultimate prize, the key to unlocking the elite social status she so desperately craved. Now Yvonne was forced to sit in a hospital bed and listen as that very same woman degraded her humanity, mocked her heritage, and revealed that her affection was nothing but a calculated, predatory financial scam. Yvonne looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, agonizing clarity. She finally saw the monstrous reality of the woman she had chosen over her own flesh and blood. She opened her mouth, a pathetic, strangled sob escaping her throat, but she lacked the words to articulate the massive, crushing magnitude of her own colossal mistake. She had traded her loyal, successful daughter for a vicious, racist criminal who despised her. Harper spun back around her chest, heaving heavily as she faced the completely stoic federal agents. She realized her racist, unhinged outburst had done absolutely nothing to intimidate the authorities standing before her. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, deliberately pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his black tactical belt. The sharp metallic clink echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room, signaling the absolute end of her privileged, untouchable existence. Harper took a frantic, stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with genuine primal terror. She threw her manicured hands up defensively, desperately scrambling to find a brand new target she could easily sacrifice to save herself. She looked directly at the federal agent and frantically attempted to strike a pathetic plea deal right there on the spot. She pointed her trembling finger directly at the older woman sitting in the hospital bed. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she did not forge any of the fraudulent church checks. She yelled frantically that she was innocent and that it was Yvonne who possessed the ultimate signatory authority for the charity accounts. Harper shrieked wildly that Yvonne was the corrupt mastermind who physically signed every single stolen document and willingly handed all the dirty money over to her without any hesitation. She promised the agents she would testify against Yvonne to save her own skin. She swore that she had never touched a single cent of the church scholarship fund. She aggressively pointed at the television screen, declaring that the offshore account in her name was secretly established. Harper's frantic accusations echoed loudly off the sterile hospital walls, her perfectly manicured finger still pointing accusingly at the massive television screen displaying the offshore account. The seasoned federal agents did not even blink at her desperate, unhinged performance. They had seen countless white-collar criminals attempt to trade their own family members for a reduced sentence the moment the federal net closed around them. Marcus stared blankly at his wife, his mouth opening and closing silently, as the absolute reality of her betrayal finally registered in his mind. The cruel woman he had lied for, the woman he had stolen for, the woman he had just attempted to send his own biological sister to federal prison to protect, was actively offering him up to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a silver platter. The last remaining shred of his fabricated arrogant dignity evaporated into the cold, conditioned air of the medical suite. He looked at the armed agents standing near the doorway, their hands resting securely near their utility belts. He looked at the local police officers, who were now deliberately stepping further away from the bed, ensuring they were completely separated from the unfolding federal catastrophe. Marcus realized that neither his mother's tears nor his wife's elite social connections could save him from the apocalyptic digital evidence glowing brightly on the wall. He was entirely out of options, out of allies, and completely out of time. He turned his head slowly, his terrified, bloodshot eyes locking directly onto me. He did not hesitate. Marcus took 2 stumbling steps forward, his legs visibly shaking beneath his expensive tailored trousers. He collapsed directly onto his knees on the hard linoleum floor right in front of my chair. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a pathetic mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he did not bother to wipe it away. He reached out with both of his trembling hands, attempting to grab the fabric of my dark blazer, but I smoothly leaned backward, ensuring he could not touch me. He began to weep, loud, ugly, gasping sobs that tore through his chest. He begged me to help him. He pointed frantically at the smart television screen above us, pleading with me to use my administrative access to shut the entire system down. He cried out that since I was the chief executive officer of the cybersecurity firm, I possessed the ultimate power to manipulate the digital dashboard. He begged me to log into the federal tracking software, erase the undeniable audit trail, and permanently delete the transaction history linking him to the stolen community church funds. He promised me he would pay back every single cent if I just gave him a few weeks to liquidate his assets. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, his voice cracking as he delivered the ultimate desperate manipulation tactic. He cried out that we were family, that we grew up in the same house, and that we were bound together by blood. He screamed, "We are blood, Serena. You can't let them take me." I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy, nor did I feel any lingering trace of sisterly affection. I looked at him with absolute freezing ice in my eyes. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap, completely unbothered by his dramatic, hysterical display. I did not raise my voice, but my words sliced through the sterile hospital room with lethal surgical precision. I reminded Marcus of the exact moment that occurred less than 10 minutes ago in this very same room. I asked him if he remembered standing by the hospital bed, sweating in his tailored suit, while his entitled wife and her slick corporate lawyer actively attempted to orchestrate my false arrest. I asked him if he remembered looking directly into the eyes of the local police officers and falsely declaring that I was the bitter, jealous criminal who stole the legacy scholarship money. I reminded him that when given the absolute choice between telling the simple truth to protect his innocent sister or lying to save his own miserable, corrupt lifestyle, he enthusiastically chose to throw me into a federal penitentiary without a single second of hesitation. I told him that he did not see me as his blood when he tried to destroy my entire future just to secure a down payment for a luxury yacht in Miami. I told him that his sudden, desperate reliance on our biological connection was nothing but a cowardly, manipulative tactic deployed by a man who had finally run out of victims to exploit. I stood up slowly from the vinyl visitor chair towering over his kneeling, trembling form. I looked down at his tear-stained face one last time, ensuring that my final words would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. I said, "Blood doesn't bleed you dry, Marcus." I did not offer him another single glance. I stepped smoothly around his kneeling body, creating a clear, unobstructed path between him and the waiting federal authorities. My movement completely shattered his final, desperate delusion of safety. The lead FBI agent immediately stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding loudly against the pristine hospital linoleum floor. He reached securely behind his back, smoothly pulling out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs that caught the harsh fluorescent overhead light. He walked directly past the utterly stunned local police officers, asserting his absolute federal jurisdiction without uttering a single word to them. He stopped right in front of the hospital bed, towering ominously over the shaking figures of Marcus and Harper. His voice was incredibly deep, utterly authoritative, and completely devoid of any trace of human emotion. He looked down at them and announced, "Marcus and Harper, you are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The cold reality of those words finally broke Harper. She let out a piercing, guttural scream that echoed through the entire VIP suite. As the lead federal agent stepped forward and grabbed her arm, she began to thrash violently. She kicked her expensive designer heels against the rolling medical tray, sending metal instruments crashing to the linoleum floor. She twisted her body side to side, sobbing hysterically, and demanding that someone call her father immediately. She yelled that she was a respectable citizen, that she belonged to an elite country club, and that people like her did not belong in handcuffs. The federal agent remained completely unfazed by her chaotic tantrum. He effortlessly spun her around, forcing her arms behind her back with practiced mechanical precision. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a sharp, echoing snap that instantly silenced her screaming. Harper slumped forward, her blonde hair falling in a tangled mess across her tear-stained face. The pristine, untouchable suburban princess had officially become a federal suspect. Beside her, Marcus did not fight back. He did not yell or demand a lawyer. He simply went completely limp. The remaining shred of his fabricated confidence evaporated into the sterile hospital air. As the second FBI agent approached him, Marcus dropped his head into his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. He fell forward, his knees hitting the floor with a loud thud. The agent pulled Marcus up by his tailored collar, easily securing the cuffs around his trembling wrists. The agent began reciting his Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice. Marcus wept loudly, his chest heaving as the rights were read to him. I was informed that he had the right to remain silent. A right he desperately wished he had exercised before throwing his own sister under the bus. He was told that anything he said could and would be used against him in a court of law. He offered no resistance, allowing the agent to hold him firmly by the shoulder. His entire world, built on lies, stolen money, and unearned arrogance, had collapsed completely. The two local police officers stood frozen near the door, their faces pale with profound embarrassment. Just 10 minutes ago, they had been fully prepared to tackle me to the ground and haul me away in a cruiser based entirely on Harper's manufactured tears. Now they were standing in the presence of federal authorities executing a massive corporate fraud bust. The lead FBI agent turned his imposing gaze toward the local cops. He did not reprimand them for their earlier gullibility. He simply gave them a sharp, authoritative nod and ordered them to assist in clearing the suspects out of the hospital perimeter. The local officers scrambled to comply, eager to redeem themselves and escape the humiliating situation. They rushed forward, stepping around the spilled coffee and the discarded legal documents. The taller officer grabbed Harper by her arm, completely ignoring her pathetic whimpers, while his partner took hold of Marcus. Together with the federal agents, they began marching my brother and my sister-in-law away toward the heavy wooden door. The transition was breathtaking to witness. The local police had become my inadvertent security detail, actively removing the toxic threats from my immediate presence. As the chaotic procession shuffled out into the brightly lit hospital corridor, the heavy door swung partially shut, leaving me entirely alone in the suite with Yvonne. My mother sat frozen in the center of the plush hospital bed, her hands clutching the luxurious silk sheets. The color had drained completely from her face, leaving her looking hollow-aged and utterly broken. She stared at the empty space where her golden child had just been dragged away in heavy steel chains. She slowly turned her head, her terrified, bloodshot eyes locking onto my calm, steady posture. The harsh reality of her monumental failure finally pierced through her lifelong delusion. She realized that the daughter she had mocked, alienated, and actively conspired to imprison was the only person left in her entire fractured world. Yvonne let out a pathetic, strangled sob. Tears began streaming down her wrinkled cheeks in thick, continuous rivers. She scrambled toward the edge of the mattress, tossing the silk blankets aside. She reached both of her trembling arms out toward me, her voice cracking with desperate manufactured sorrow. She began apologizing profusely, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a frantic, jumbled mess. She cried out that she was so incredibly sorry for everything she had ever done to me. She swore that she never actually wanted to see me arrested. She insisted that she had been completely brainwashed by Harper's manipulative lies and suburban charm. She sobbed loudly, claiming that she was just a confused, frightened old woman who had been tricked into betraying her own flesh and blood. She leaned forward desperately, trying to wrap her shaking arms around my waist, seeking the comforting maternal embrace she had denied me for 33 long, agonizing years. I did not step backward to avoid her sudden movement. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman reaching for my affection, and I felt absolutely nothing in my soul. No pity for her, no sadness for her completely ruined life, no lingering maternal bond left to exploit. I calmly reached out with my hand and grabbed her wrist, stopping her hands from making any physical contact with my tailored blazer. I pulled my arm firmly out of her desperate grasp, forcing her to fall back against the hospital mattress. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes, my voice dropping to a perfectly even, freezing whisper that commanded absolute attention in the quiet room. I told her the absolute, undeniable truth about her own toxic, pathetic choices. I said, "You weren't brainwashed by her at all. You were just blinded by a status you thought she could give you." The absolute truth of my words hit Yvonne like a violent physical strike. She flinched sharply, pulling her trembling hands back against her chest as if she had just touched a burning stove. The luxurious VIP hospital room, previously a symbol of her fabricated elite status, now felt like a sterile prison cell closing in around her. I stood tall beside the hospital bed, completely unmoving, refusing to offer a single shred of the maternal comfort she was desperately begging to receive. I slowly looked around the lavish medical suite, carefully noting the expensive floral arrangements and premium coffee cups scattered across the rolling tables. I turned my attention back to the weeping woman who had spent decades sacrificing my mental health simply to secure her own twisted illusion of suburban grandeur. I told her that the pathetic fantasy was officially over. I informed her that because her precious golden child was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle on his way to a maximum security prison, the fraudulent mortgage application was completely dead in the water. I explained that the private lending firm had permanently canceled the transaction the second the FBI seized Marcus and froze his digital assets. I made sure she understood that there would be no $170,000 payout arriving today or any other day. There would be no luxury yacht docked in Miami. There would be absolutely nothing left to fund the fake wealthy lifestyle she had actively destroyed our family to proudly protect. Yvonne stared up at me, her jaw trembling uncontrollably as she frantically tried to process the catastrophic financial reality crashing down upon her shoulders. She stammered nervously, wiping a streak of mascara from her cheek, asking what was going to happen to Big Mama's historic house now that the commercial loan was officially canceled. She foolishly assumed she could simply pack up her designer overnight bags, take a comfortable premium taxi back to the quiet suburbs, and seamlessly resume living rent-free under my roof as if this entire nightmare had never happened. I shattered that final pathetic delusion with absolute surgical precision. I told her she was never stepping foot inside that historic property ever again. I revealed my ultimate plan for the estate, a comprehensive legal strategy I had set into motion the very moment my cybersecurity software first detected Marcus stealing from our community. I announced that my corporate attorneys were currently finalizing the paperwork to legally donate the entire historic property directly to the community church. I explained that the current market value of the massive estate would perfectly cover the financial deficit Marcus and Harper had created when they callously embezzled the legacy scholarship funds. I told her I was not just handing over a blank check to blindly balance a stolen ledger. I informed her that the church board of directors had already enthusiastically agreed to my specific legal conditions for the donation. Big Mama's house was going to be completely renovated and permanently converted into a state-of-the-art community youth center for disadvantaged children. It would directly serve the exact same vulnerable community that her precious openly racist daughter-in-law had just viciously degraded and robbed blind. The remaining color drained entirely from Yvonne's face, leaving her looking completely hollow and utterly defeated. The terrifying realization that she was officially undeniably homeless finally registered in her panicked mind. She began to hyperventilate again, her breathing turning shallow and erratic as she frantically looked around the luxurious room. Her wrinkled hands gripped the expensive silk sheets tightly as she demanded to know exactly where she was supposed to live tonight. She cried out that she was a respectable aging woman who could not possibly survive living on the dangerous city streets. She wept bitterly, begging me to let her stay in one of the spare bedrooms at my personal home in Atlanta. She desperately promised that she would cook every meal, clean every floor, and do whatever I commanded if I just showed her a tiny ounce of mercy and gave her a second chance to be a real mother. I did not blink. I did not soften my posture. I reached calmly into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small, plain white envelope. I tossed it effortlessly onto the rolling bedside table, letting it land right next to her half-empty spilled caramel latte. I told her she was not coming anywhere near my personal home or my successful life. I explained that inside the plain envelope she would find a cheap prepaid magnetic keycard for a budget motel located on the absolute grimiest outskirts of the city. I told her I had generously paid for exactly 1 week of basic lodging. I pointed to the table, noting that right next to the plastic motel key was a standard one-way Greyhound bus pass. I told her she had exactly 7 days to sit in that cheap motel room and figure out which distant estranged relative she was going to burden next, because my personal charity had officially expired forever. Yvonne let out a devastating, heartbroken wail, burying her face into her hands as she finally realized the absolute totality of her immense loss. She had traded a loyal, highly successful daughter for a fleeting illusion of status, and now she had absolutely nothing to show for it but a plastic motel key and a bus ticket. She looked up at me one last time, her eyes completely bloodshot, silently pleading for a final reprieve from the harsh consequences of her own toxic actions. I buttoned my blazer and checked the sleek digital interface on my smartwatch, completely ignoring her tears. I looked down at her and delivered the final crushing blow. "My team already packed your things," I said, my voice echoing with total uncompromising finality in the quiet room. "Checkout for this VIP suite is in 10 minutes. I turned my back on the sobbing woman who had once been my mother and walked purposefully out of the luxurious medical suite. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing Yvonne inside her new terrifying reality. I stepped into the brightly lit hospital corridor, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. The sterile scent of antiseptic and floor wax hit my senses, grounding me in the present moment. Down the hall, a spectacular scene of absolute justice was unfolding. The two armed federal agents were marching my brother and his corrupt wife toward the main bank of elevators. Marcus shuffled forward with his head bowed completely down, his expensive leather shoes squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. He looked utterly defeated, a broken man finally facing the devastating consequences of his lifelong entitlement. Harper, however, was still actively fighting the inevitable. She twisted her shoulders, her wrists bound tightly by the heavy steel handcuffs, and glared viciously at the hospital staff lining the walls. The nursing staff had abandoned their charting stations and gathered in the hallway to witness the highly anticipated departure. Earlier that morning, Harper had mercilessly degraded these hard-working professionals. She had screamed at them about the room temperature, complained about the quality of the cafeteria coffee, and threatened to have several orderlies fired for not moving fast enough to satisfy her suburban demands. Now those same nurses stood in a quiet, deeply satisfying row, watching their former tormentor, being perp walked out of the cardiology wing by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Harper noticed their collective gaze and bared her teeth like a cornered animal. She spat a venomous insult at a young orderly, demanding he stop staring at her. The orderly did not flinch or look away. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and smiled a slow, triumphant smile. The lead federal agent gave Harper a sharp tug on her arm, forcing her to face forward and walk toward the waiting elevator doors. I continued down the hallway, keeping a comfortable distance behind the chaotic procession. As I passed the central nursing station, a familiar face stepped out from behind the high counter. It was Jessica, my former high school chemistry partner, and the quick-thinking nurse who had pulled me into the supply closet just an hour ago. She had taken off her surgical mask, revealing a bright, genuine smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes. She leaned against the counter, her arms folded comfortably, watching the elevator doors slide shut, permanently trapping Marcus and Harper inside with the federal authorities. Jessica turned her head and caught my eye. We did not need to exchange a single spoken word to communicate the profound magnitude of what had just transpired. She gave me a slow, respectful nod, silently acknowledging the absolute masterclass in accountability I had just delivered. I stopped walking for a brief second. I looked at the woman who had helped me uncover the extortion plot, and I offered her a warm, authentic smile in return. I walked past the nursing station and headed toward the opposite end of the corridor. I bypassed the main elevators, choosing instead to take the quiet, secluded stairwell down to the ground floor. My high heels clicked rhythmically against the concrete steps, echoing in the empty, reverberating space. With every single step I took, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting off my chest. For 33 years, I had carried the agonizing burden of my family and their toxic expectations. I had exhausted myself trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of valuing my existence. I had let their cruel comparisons and harsh criticisms define my self-esteem. Now that heavy, invisible chain was permanently broken. I reached the bottom of the stairwell and pushed open the heavy fire door, stepping out into the bustling main lobby of the hospital. The emergency room waiting area was a chaotic symphony of human misery and panic. Paramedics rushed past me with a rattling gurney, shouting medical codes to a waiting trauma team. Anxious family members paced the waiting room floors, clutching crumpled tissues and staring blankly at the muted television screens mounted on the walls. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows across the crowded room. I navigated through the chaotic maze of people with calm, deliberate strides. I did not belong in this frantic environment anymore. I pushed through the final set of heavy double doors and stepped into the small glass vestibule. The automatic sliding doors detected my presence and parted with a soft mechanical swoosh. I stepped completely out of the hospital and onto the concrete curb. The frantic, overwhelming noise of the emergency room instantly faded away behind me, replaced by the cool, quiet serenity of the Atlanta night air. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a sprawling landscape of towering glass skyscrapers and brilliant pulsing lights. A gentle breeze blew past me, carrying the faint, earthy scent of incoming rain and city pavement. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, refreshing air. I looked up at the dark, expansive sky, feeling a profound sense of absolute liberation wash over my entire body. I had walked into that hospital as a targeted victim, but I was walking out as the undisputed architect of my own destiny. I stood alone on the quiet curb, waiting for my private transportation. I smoothed down my blaze one last time, relishing the victory of the evening. The silence was suddenly broken by a sharp, rhythmic vibration against my left wrist. I raised my arm, twisting my wrist to look down at the glowing digital interface of my smartwatch. The screen illuminated the darkness with a bright, urgent red banner. It was a secure, encrypted notification sent directly from the executive board of directors at Aegis Financial. I smiled, preparing to answer the most important call of my life. I raised my left wrist higher, angling the glowing screen of my smartwatch away from the harsh glare of the distant streetlights. The encrypted red banner flashed twice before biometric scanners confirmed my identity, seamlessly unlocking the urgent communication from my board of directors. The message was from David, my chief operating officer. The text was brief, precise, and absolutely monumental. He wrote that the final negotiations had concluded successfully just moments ago, and the Department of Defense had officially signed the new cybersecurity contract with Aegis Financial. The total finalized value of the government agreement was a staggering $50 million, securing our company as the undisputed primary digital auditing infrastructure for the next decade. I read the glowing numbers on the tiny screen a second time, letting the immense magnitude of the professional victory wash over me. I tapped a quick professional reply to David, thanking him and the board for their relentless dedication, and turned off the screen. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for 33 years suddenly vanished, leaving behind a profound, almost dizzying physical lightness. I stood perfectly still on the hospital curb, breathing in the crisp Atlanta night air, and I realized that I was finally breathing for myself. For my entire life, I had contorted my personality, hidden my massive successes, and swallowed my pride, all in a desperate, futile attempt to earn a single scrap of genuine validation from a family that was absolutely determined to misunderstand me. I had allowed Yvonne to treat me like an embarrassing burden. I had allowed Marcus to parade around as the golden child, while he secretly drained the lifeblood from our community. I had allowed Harper to weaponize her toxic privilege against me without fighting back. That pathetic, lingering hope had officially died inside the sterile VIP medical suite tonight, and its death was the single most liberating experience of my entire life. I realized with absolute unwavering certainty that I did not need their approval, their fake affection, or their toxic presence to be a complete successful human being. The quiet hum of a powerful engine broke through my silent reflection. A sleek, immaculate black Maybach pulled smoothly up to the hospital curb, the tires gliding silently against the concrete. The $500,000 luxury vehicle gleamed perfectly under the streetlights, a flawless, imposing testament to the massive corporate empire I had built entirely from scratch with my own two hands. The car glided to a gentle stop exactly 1 foot away from where I was standing. The driver's side door opened immediately, and my private chauffeur, an impeccably dressed man named Thomas wearing a tailored black suit and a sharp tie, stepped out onto the pavement. He walked around the rear of the massive vehicle with practiced, elegant efficiency. Thomas offered a polite, dignified nod, acknowledging my presence before he reached out and pulled the heavy, armored rear passenger door wide open for me. The plush, custom leather interior of the Maybach glowed with soft, ambient lighting. I stepped closer to the open door, taking a moment to appreciate the beautiful contrast between the life my family thought I lived and the reality I actually commanded. They truly believed I was a miserable, broke basement coder who would eagerly empty her pathetic savings account just to win a shred of maternal affection. They believed I was desperate enough to be easily extorted, weak enough to be intimidated by local police, and stupid enough to take the fall for their sloppy, arrogant crimes. Instead, I was the chief executive officer of a federal contractor stepping into a vehicle that cost more than the combined net worth of everyone they had ever desperately tried to impress. I placed my hand on the edge of the open car door, preparing to slide into the luxurious leather seat and leave this miserable chapter of my life completely behind me in the dust. Suddenly, the harsh mechanical screech of the automatic hospital emergency doors sliding aggressively open shattered the quiet serenity of the night. I paused, my hand still resting on the frame of the Maybach, and slowly turned my head to look back over my shoulder. Yvonne stumbled clumsily out of the brightly lit hospital vestibule and onto the dark concrete sidewalk. She was no longer wearing her expensive silk pajamas, having been forcefully evicted from the luxury suite by the hospital administration. She was dressed in wrinkled, mismatched sweatpants and a cheap promotional t-shirt. Her hair was a disheveled, chaotic mess, and her face was heavily streaked with smeared, ruined makeup. She was not holding a designer handbag or a crystal coffee cup. She was desperately clutching two thin, cheap plastic trash bags filled to the absolute brim with her hurriedly packed belongings. She looked exactly like what she truly was, a broken, toxic woman who had arrogantly gambled away every single blessing she had ever been given. Yvonne dragged her heavy plastic trash bags across the pavement, her head bowed in ultimate crushing defeat. She stopped near the edge of the curb, gasping for breath, and slowly lifted her tear-stained face to look around the dark parking lot. Her bloodshot eyes locked directly onto me. She froze completely, her jaw dropping open in absolute, unadulterated shock. The cheap plastic bag slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the dirty concrete with a pathetic rustling thud. She stared at the sleek, towering black Maybach. She stared at the impeccably dressed chauffeur, standing at attention, holding the door open for me with absolute reverence. She stared at the custom leather interior, the glowing ambient lights, and the undeniable staggering display of monumental wealth radiating from the vehicle. Then her wide, horrified eyes slowly moved up to meet my calm, indifferent gaze. She looked at the daughter she had viciously mocked as a broke, useless failure, and she finally truly understood the apocalyptic magnitude of the empire she had just thrown away forever. Yvonne stood absolutely paralyzed on the dirty concrete curb, the chilly night wind whipping her disheveled hair across her tear-stained face. She took one pathetic, trembling step forward, leaving her cheap plastic trash bags abandoned on the ground behind her. She reached her shaking hand out toward the gleaming black Maybach, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly for a few agonizing seconds. Finally, a single desperate word escaped her lips. She called my name, her voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of profound regret, bottomless sorrow, and desperate pleading. She expected me to roll down the tinted window. She expected me to hurl a final vicious insult, to scream at her, to gloat over my monumental triumph, or perhaps to finally offer her the unearned maternal salvation she was begging to receive. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not raise my voice, and I did not lower my window. I simply stood by the open car door and looked at her. I offered her nothing but total, crushing, absolute indifference. I looked right through the broken woman on the sidewalk, as if she were completely invisible, a total stranger who meant absolutely nothing anymore. I turned my back on Yvonne for the final time and gracefully stepped into the luxurious, spacious rear cabin of the Maybach. I settled into the plush, heated leather seat, letting the soft, ambient interior lighting wash over me. Thomas, my impeccable chauffeur, firmly pushed the heavy armored door shut. The thick, soundproof glass completely severed me from the toxic, chaotic reality of my biological family forever. The heavy click of the mechanical lock was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I reached forward to the polished mahogany center console and grabbed a cold crystal glass. I smoothly poured myself a serving of sparkling water. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the crisp carbonation cool my throat as I leaned back against the comfortable headrest. I turned my gaze toward the heavily tinted passenger window, looking out at the chaotic hospital parking lot one last time. In the far distance, cutting through the dark night, I saw the blinding, flashing red and blue lights of two federal police cruisers pulling aggressively out of the emergency loading zone. Marcus and Harper were secured tightly in the back of those heavily armored government vehicles now. Their arrogant, fraudulent lives were completely destroyed, and they were being driven directly toward a federal holding facility. Thomas smoothly shifted the massive luxury vehicle into gear, and the Maybach pulled seamlessly away from the hospital curb, effortlessly accelerating into the steady flow of late-night city traffic. Through the rear window, I caught one final fleeting glimpse of Yvonne. She was still standing completely alone on the sidewalk, a tiny, insignificant figure shivering in the cold, surrounded only by her plastic garbage bags. Then the car turned a sharp corner, and she disappeared from my rearview mirror forever. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my executive office in Midtown Atlanta, casting a warm golden glow across the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I stood perfectly still with a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand, looking down at the sprawling, vibrant city, bustling dozens of stories below me. The suffocating toxic weight of my family had been entirely lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of clarity and absolute control. My sprawling fintech empire, Aegis Financial, was operating seamlessly all around me. Dozens of brilliant, highly paid analysts and software engineers moved purposefully through the sleek, modern corridors of our corporate headquarters. For 33 years, I had allowed a group of bitter, manipulative people to convince me that I was a worthless, invisible disappointment. I had let my mother and brother treat my staggering professional success like a shameful, dirty secret simply because it did not fit into their twisted suburban narrative. Today, that fabricated narrative was officially dead and buried. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast, as I walked over to the massive flat-screen smart television mounted securely on my office wall. I picked up the sleek silver remote control resting on the glass conference table and tapped the power button. I did not turn the television on to check the stock market or review global financial trends. I turned it on to witness the absolute inevitable destruction of my older brother. The local Atlanta morning news broadcasts were already running the explosive breaking story on a continuous, relentless loop. I watched with quiet, terrifying satisfaction as Marcus had his pristine, carefully curated reputation completely obliterated on live television. A massive high-definition photograph of my brother was plastered prominently across the screen, positioned directly next to the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The perfectly groomed, untouchable golden child of the community church had been officially reduced to a disgraced, pathetic federal suspect. The news anchors spoke in hushed, gravely serious tones as they detailed the shocking midnight raid at the hospital. They methodically outlined the staggering scale of the financial crimes, explicitly stating that Marcus had ruthlessly embezzled $170,000 directly from the Legacy Scholarship Fund. The reporters did not hold back a detail. They explicitly emphasized that the stolen money was specifically intended to send disadvantaged youth to college. The community backlash was immediate and absolutely catastrophic. My smartwatch buzzed continuously with automated social media alerts as local church members, neighborhood leaders, and former family friends took to the internet to express their profound disgust. Marcus had spent his entire adult life building a fake, hollow empire based on moral superiority and unearned privilege. He had weaponized his charm to manipulate the congregation and shield his incompetence. Now every person in the city knew exactly what he truly was behind closed doors. He was a cowardly, selfish thief who had actively robbed the very community he swore to protect. The breaking news banner at the bottom of the screen shifted to display footage of the community church. Reporters were standing on the front steps trying to get a statement from the congregation. Suddenly, the sleek, multi-line telephone sitting on my mahogany desk let out a soft, professional chime. My executive assistant informed me over the intercom that I had an urgent, high-priority incoming call on line 1. She stated that the official board of elders from the community church was requesting to speak with me immediately. I walked over to my desk, pressed the flashing green button, and connected the call on speakerphone. The deep, solemn voices of the church elders filled my spacious office. They did not call to ask for favors or to demand unnecessary explanations about my brother. They called to profusely thank me for my unprecedented, staggering generosity and technical brilliance. The lead elder spoke with genuine, overwhelming emotion as he formally thanked me for utilizing my proprietary software to catch the catastrophic fraud before the stolen funds were permanently lost in an offshore labyrinth. He expressed his boundless gratitude for the immediate legal transfer of the historic property. He informed me that my corporate attorneys had successfully processed the donation of Big Mama's house early this morning. He confirmed that the sprawling estate would be permanently converted into a state-of-the-art youth center, completely erasing the toxic stain of my brother's crimes from the family legacy. I smiled, feeling a deep, resonating sense of cultural and personal pride. I told the elders that it was my absolute honor to protect the community that had shaped my resilience. I assured them that Aegis Financial would gladly provide the church with complimentary military-grade accounting software to ensure that a massive financial breach like this could never happen again. The lead elder thanked me profusely once more, his voice cracking slightly with relief. Before he disconnected the call, he paused, letting out a heavy, exhausted sigh. He told me he had just received an update from the federal courthouse regarding the arraignment hearings. He mentioned that Harper's wealthy, influential father had furiously stormed into the federal building at dawn, flanked by a team of elite corporate defense attorneys. Her father had aggressively attempted to post a massive cash bail to get his precious, entitled daughter out of a federal holding cell before the media could completely destroy his prestigious law firm's reputation. The elder let out a dark, satisfied chuckle. He informed me that the presiding federal judge took one look at the undeniable digital evidence of the offshore shell companies and the Cayman Islands bank accounts. The judge immediately slammed the gavel down and denied Harper any bail whatsoever. The judge officially declared my arrogant, racist sister-in-law to be an extreme international flight risk. Harper was going to sit in a cold federal holding cell until her trial began. 2 weeks passed before I saw my brother and sister-in-law again. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was an imposing structure of solid granite and towering marble columns. It was a building designed to replace arrogance with the crushing weight of absolute justice. I walked through the security checkpoint wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight. I did not come to the arraignment to offer emotional support or post bail. I came strictly as a silent spectator. I wanted to witness the final, undeniable conclusion of their miserable, fabricated lives. I slipped quietly through the heavy oak doors and took a seat in the last row of the wooden gallery benches. The massive room was packed with local reporters, community church members, and federal prosecutors carrying thick stacks of printed evidence. The air was thick with anticipation. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was a volatile mixture of profound grief and simmering righteous anger. I sat silently in this back row, completely unnoticed by the distracted crowd, observing the catastrophic fallout of my family's greed. To my left, sitting tightly together in the third row, were several elderly members of the community church. I recognized Mrs. Higgins, the sweet, soft-spoken woman who had organized the Sunday school bake sales for the last 2 decades. She was clutching a crumpled tissue, weeping softly into her husband's shoulder. Next to her sat the parents of 3 high-achieving, low-income high school seniors. These were the exact families who had received official letters just weeks prior, promising them that the Legacy Scholarship Fund would completely cover their children's college tuition. Marcus and Harper had looked these hardworking parents directly in the eyes, smiled their pristine suburban smiles, and then systematically robbed their children of a future. Across the center aisle, the demographic shifted drastically. The front rows behind the defense table were usually reserved for loyal family members and supportive friends. Today, those benches were glaringly empty, save for a few junior legal associates, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Harper's elite country club friends, the wealthy socialites she had spent years desperately trying to impress, were nowhere to be found. The moment the federal indictment had been unsealed and the full, embarrassing scope of her crimes hit the local news networks, her affluent social circle had evaporated like water on hot pavement. In the world of high society, white-collar crime was occasionally forgiven, but public humiliation and federal asset seizure were highly contagious diseases. Harper had become an absolute social pariah overnight. The low murmur of the gallery was suddenly cut short by the sharp, authoritative voice of the court bailiff ordering everyone to rise. The sheer tension in the room spiked exponentially. The federal prosecutors, a team of sharp-eyed men and women wearing immaculate conservative suits, organized their massive binders of digital evidence on the prosecution table. They looked completely relaxed, fully armed with the irrefutable, unalterable data logs my cybersecurity firm had legally handed over to the Department of Justice. This was not going to be a long, drawn-out legal battle. This was going to be an absolute surgical execution of justice. A heavy side door near the judge's bench swung open. The sudden clanking of heavy metal chains echoed loudly across the cavernous room. Two armed United States Marshals escorted them into the courtroom. I barely recognized the man shuffling toward the defense table. Marcus was stripped of his tailored Italian suits, his expensive watches, and his arrogant golden child swagger. He was wearing a baggy neon orange prison jumpsuit. His hands and ankles were bound by steel chains that rattled with every pathetic step he took. He looked physically diminished, his shoulders slumped forward in ultimate crushing defeat. His hair was an unkempt mess, and dark bruised bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. He looked exactly like a broken man who finally understood his entire existence was an unforgivable lie. Harper was escorted in right behind him, and her transformation was even more spectacular. The wealthy, entitled suburban princess, who had weaponized her white privilege to manipulate my family, was entirely gone. She was drowning in an oversized khaki institutional uniform. Her blonde highlights had faded, revealing dark, greasy roots. She was weeping hysterically, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. For her entire life, Harper firmly believed her elite social status and wealthy family connections made her untouchable. She believed she could hurl racist insults, steal from disadvantaged children, and frame an innocent woman without facing a consequence. The cold, hard reality of the federal justice system violently shattered that delusion. She faced multiple counts of federal wire fraud conspiracy and international money laundering, all backed by the undeniable digital evidence my software permanently captured. Her tears were not tears of genuine remorse for the community she robbed. They were tears of pure, selfish terror. The federal judge, a stern man with an absolutely no-nonsense demeanor, struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. He called the high-profile fraud case to order, his booming voice commanding instant silence from the packed gallery. He read the devastating list of federal charges aloud for the official court record. Harper frantically scanned the front rows of the courtroom gallery. She was desperately searching for her father, the high-powered corporate attorney she always relied on to bully his way through her problems. She spotted him sitting rigidly in the second row, flanked by two junior partners from his prestigious law firm. Harper let out a pathetic, desperate cry, begging her father to stand up and tell the judge this was a massive mistake. She pleaded with him to use his wealth and influence to make the federal prosecutors drop the charges. Her father slowly stood up from the wooden bench. He did not look at his weeping daughter with an ounce of paternal affection. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and addressed the federal judge directly. He spoke in a loud, incredibly clear voice, ensuring every single reporter in the room recorded his exact words. He stated for the official court record that his prestigious corporate law firm had absolutely no involvement in this catastrophic criminal enterprise. He explicitly declared he was not there to represent his daughter in any legal capacity. He told the judge his firm completely condemned her horrific, malicious actions against a vulnerable community charity. He announced publicly in front of the entire packed courtroom that he was permanently severing all personal and professional ties with her. He refused to let his immaculate, decades-old legal empire be tainted by her sloppy, arrogant violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. Harper let out a blood-curdling, devastated scream as her father turned his back on her and marched straight out of the courtroom. Her ultimate safety net had just publicly disowned her. She collapsed against the heavy wooden defense table, sobbing so violently the federal marshals had to physically hold her upright. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. He slammed his gavel down and officially denied bail for both defendants, citing the overwhelming digital evidence and the massive international flight risk. He ordered them remanded to federal custody until the trial commenced. The marshals grabbed Marcus by his arms, forcing him to turn around and face the gallery as they prepared to march him back to his cold cell. As he shuffled slowly toward the holding doors, his desperate, terrified eyes scanned the crowd. He looked past the furious church members and the scribbling reporters. His gaze finally landed on the very back row. He saw me sitting there in my tailored suit, perfectly calm, perfectly successful, and perfectly untouchable. The crushing realization of his monumental failure hit him all over again. He stopped walking for a brief second. He looked directly into my eyes, his face twisting into a mask of pure agony. He slowly mouthed the word sorry. I did not offer him a smile of victory. I did not give him a nod of forgiveness. I simply looked at the broken man who used to be my brother and felt absolutely nothing at all. I broke eye contact, stood up from the wooden bench, and confidently walked out of the heavy courtroom doors. 6 months after the federal courthouse doors swung shut behind me, I stood under the bright Atlanta sky. The crisp air smelled of fresh paint and magnolias. I was standing on the pristine front lawn of what used to be a point of bitter contention, but was now a beacon of absolute triumph. Big Mama's historic house had undergone a staggering transformation. The peeling paint and toxic memories of Marcus and Yvonne had been completely stripped away. In their place stood a magnificent, fully renovated community youth center. The sprawling Victorian structure was restored to its former architectural glory, dramatically enhanced with modern glass additions. Today was the official grand opening ceremony, and the neighborhood had gathered to witness the awaited ribbon cutting. A local marching band played upbeat music, filling the neighborhood with an infectious energy. I stood near the front of the wooden stage wearing a sharp, tailored white suit that caught the morning sunlight. The church elders who had trusted me were there, smiling with genuine joy. Several prominent local politicians stood by my side, shaking my hand and praising my vision for the community. I had fully funded the multi-million-dollar renovation entirely out of my own pocket. This was my personal gift to the neighborhood that had raised me. The lead elder of this community church stepped up to the wooden podium. He spoke passionately to the massive crowd gathered on the street. He did not mention the federal raid, the court dates, or the disgraceful downfall of the former Golden Child. He spoke only of the promising future that lay ahead for the disadvantaged children of this community. When he finally called my name, the crowd erupted into a deafening round of applause. I walked up to the microphone, looking out at the hundreds of smiling faces looking back at me. I delivered a short, powerful speech about resilience and protecting our vulnerable youth. I turned my attention to the front wall of the newly renovated house, where a heavy object was draped in a dark velvet cloth. I walked over, grabbed the corner of the velvet fabric, and pulled it away with a smooth, decisive motion. A massive, beautiful bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight. The heavy metal was deeply engraved with a loving, permanent dedication. It officially named the facility the Big Mama Community Youth Center. The plaque explicitly honored my grandmother's true legacy of selfless community care and boundless love. By cementing her name in solid bronze, I had completely permanently wiped away the dark toxic stain that Marcus and Yvonne had selfishly left on the property. The crowd cheered loudly as I stepped back. I was handed massive ceremonial scissors with bright red handles. I invited the church elders to join me at the bottom of the front steps. Together we cut the thick red ribbons stretched across the entrance, officially opening the doors to the public. Children rushed past me, eager to explore the brand new computer lab and the digital library. Parents shook my hand, expressing their profound gratitude for providing such an incredible safe resource for their kids. I stood on the top step of the porch, watching the joyful chaos unfold, with a deep, resonating sense of absolute peace in my heart. The heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family was completely gone. As I surveyed the happy crowd, my eyes naturally drifted past the edge of the manicured lawn and toward the busy city street. Across the bustling avenue directly opposite the grand new youth center, there was a small, rusted public bus stop. A battered metal bench sat beneath a faded plastic shelter. Sitting on that cold metal bench was a solitary, hunched figure. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture immediately. It was Yvonne. My mother looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, demanding woman who had comfortably sipped a caramel latte in a luxury hospital suite just 6 months ago. She had visibly aged a decade in a matter of months. Her posture was completely defeated, her shoulders slumped forward in a permanent state of exhaustion. She was wearing a cheap, faded, ill-fitting polyester uniform belonging to a local low-budget fast food chain. A stained green apron was tied loosely around her waist. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, careless knot. She clutched a cheap plastic grocery bag on her lap, waiting for the public transit bus to take her to her grueling minimum wage job. A group of prominent local politicians and successful community leaders had gathered around me, eagerly asking questions about my cybersecurity firm and my future philanthropic plans for the city of Atlanta. I smiled warmly, engaging in the high-level conversation with effortless grace and absolute confidence. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden movement across the busy street. Yvonne had slowly lifted her head from her chest. Her tired, bloodshot eyes looked across the bustling avenue, drawn by the loud cheers and the vibrant celebration happening at the youth center. Her gaze locked directly onto the beautiful, sprawling historic estate she had foolishly tried to steal. Then her eyes moved to the front porch. She saw me. She saw the daughter she had viciously mocked as a useless broke coder. She saw me standing tall and radiant in a tailored white suit, completely surrounded by a circle of admiring, powerful leaders who treated me with utmost respect. She saw the massive bronze plaque honoring the grandmother she had disrespected. Yvonne froze completely on the metal bench. The devastating, crushing reality of her colossal failure hit her with the force of a physical blow. She realized she was looking at an empire of success, wealth, and profound respect that she would never be allowed to touch. She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, her face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute shame. I did not wave. I did not look away. I simply held her gaze with perfect, chilling indifference. The loud hiss of air brakes broke the silence as a crowded city bus pulled up to the curb, completely blocking her from my view. When the heavy bus eventually pulled away, churning a thick cloud of dark exhaust smoke into the air, the metal bench was entirely empty. Yvonne had lowered her head in ultimate crushing defeat and boarded the bus, disappearing into the bleak, miserable existence she had purposefully chosen for herself. I turned my back to the busy street, offered a bright smile to the mayor standing beside me, and confidently walked through the front doors of my brand new youth center. I walked through the sleek double-glass doors of Aegis Financial Headquarters. The polished marble floors clicked softly beneath my designer heels, echoing through the expansive modern lobby. For the first time in my entire life, I felt no lingering shadows of my past. The suffocating weight of my toxic family was permanently erased from my mind. I greeted the front desk security team with a warm, genuine smile. They nodded respectfully, completely unaware of the massive personal victory I had just achieved. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the top button. The stainless steel doors slid shut quietly, isolating me in a peaceful moment of upward movement. The elevator ascended smoothly toward the executive penthouse. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored walls. I was no longer the frightened scapegoat desperately begging for scraps of maternal affection. I was no longer the lonely sister paying off fraudulent debts for a spoiled brother. The woman staring back at me was a brilliant innovator, a fearless protector, and the undisputed leader of a massive financial empire. I adjusted my collar, embracing the absolute power that surged through my resilient veins right now. The elevator chimed a soft, welcoming note as the doors glided open. I stepped out into the bustling heart of my corporate headquarters. The energy on the top floor was absolutely electric, filled with sharp minds operating at peak efficiency. I walked down the main corridor, nodding at department heads, who offered me bright, enthusiastic greetings. They did not see me as an outcast or a burden. They respected me as their ultimate visionary. I approached the heavy, frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom. I placed my hand on the cool metal handle and pushed it very wide open. My entire executive team was already seated around the massive polished oak conference table. These were some of the most brilliant, diverse, and fiercely dedicated professionals in the entire technology industry. They represented a beautiful mosaic of different backgrounds, cultures, and experiences. They were a stark, refreshing contrast to the shallow, incredibly toxic, prejudiced environment my brother and sister-in-law had so desperately tried to maintain. When I entered the spacious room, every single person immediately stopped talking. They all turned their attention toward me, their faces lighting up with deep, profound respect and genuine, unwavering professional loyalty to me today. David, my chief operating officer, stood up from his chair at the far end of the table. He offered me a bright, triumphant smile that completely illuminated his face. He held a thick, meticulously organized stack of official government documents in his hands. He announced to the silent room that the final auditing review was officially complete, and the federal agency had officially approved our comprehensive software integration strategy. The team erupted into a loud, joyous round of applause. I walked confidently toward the head of the conference table, taking my rightful place at the absolute center of true power. I looked out at the talented individuals who had helped me build this incredible financial fortress from the ground up. I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude for their relentless hard work, their unmatched creativity, and their unyielding dedication to our shared mission. We had built a company that protected vulnerable institutions from the exact kind of greedy, malicious predators that my own family had unfortunately chosen to become. I raised my hand gently, and the room instantly settled back into a focused, attentive silence. I thanked them all for their phenomenal contributions to our massive, unprecedented corporate triumph today. David slid the heavy leather binder across the polished table, opening it to the final signature page. This was the defining moment. This single piece of paper represented a $50 million contract with the Department of Defense. It was the ultimate validation of my entire career. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite gold fountain pen. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I leaned forward, pressed the fine metal nib against the crisp white paper, and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes that permanently secured my financial legacy forever. I closed the leather binder with a satisfying, authoritative thud. I handed the completed contract back to David, who immediately placed it into a secure, encrypted briefcase. The deal was officially finalized, cementing Aegis Financial as an impenetrable titan in the global cybersecurity landscape. My team began to discuss the initial rollout phases and the upcoming implementation schedules. I listened to their brilliant ideas, feeling a deep, profound sense of pride in the magnificent empire I had successfully constructed. I was no longer a victim of my mother's cruel neglect or my brother's arrogant, deeply prejudiced, manipulative shadow here today. I excused myself from the lively discussion, stepping away from the long conference table to give my executives room to collaborate. I walked slowly across the expansive room, heading straight toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that lined the entire outer wall. I stood quietly near the thick, pristine glass, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent metropolis of Atlanta. The afternoon sun bathed the bustling city streets in a warm, vibrant golden light. Countless cars moved like tiny, insignificant ants far below my towering corporate sanctuary. The world felt incredibly vast, perfectly clear, and entirely full of possibilities. I smiled, a wide, breathtakingly genuine expression of total, absolute liberation. I did not feel an ounce of lingering malice, vengeance, or petty hatred toward the miserable, broken people who had tried to destroy me. They were locked in cold federal cells and trapped on lonely public transit buses, facing the severe, brutal consequences of their own malicious greed. I had simply walked away from the toxic wreckage completely untouched and forever free. I took a deep, refreshing breath, watching the beautiful, bright horizons stretch out endlessly before me. I had finally won. I had fully avenged my absolute peace.